Luke, the stage is yours.
All right. Thank you all so much for coming. As always, it's a pleasure to be here with you. And, you know, it's really interesting. Obviously, PBS is doing a special on Leonardo right now. So Leonardo is in the zeitgeist. And so it's kind of an exciting time for us to explore this together. It's interesting because I'm pretty sure most of us have probably heard of Leonardo. And so it's not unfamiliar, but there's so much that we probably don't know about it. And so I'm excited to explore that with everybody tonight. When we think about Leonardo da Vinci, we know he was a Renaissance artist, but what does that even mean? Like, what is the Renaissance and what does that mean? I know Ninja Turtles, like that's about all I got.
Right.
So what is Renaissance?
Okay, well, the Renaissance was, Renaissance actually means rebirth. And it was the rebirth of interest in ancient Roman and Greek culture. And it was a really prosperous time where there was a lot of exploration. For instance, Christopher Columbus and Amerigo Vespucci, they lived during the Renaissance. And it was a relatively peaceful time. And all the opportunities offered by all the exploration really increased trade and prosperity. So there started to be a new class of merchants rising who were, I guess, the new rich, and they wanted to show their wealth and power, and they commissioned artwork for churches, for their own palaces. So it was a really exciting time. It's also the time when, before the Renaissance, all books were handwritten on vellum or parchment. And so they were incredibly expensive, probably the price of a house. But Gutenberg's invention of the printing press and paper made books available to everyone because they were inexpensive. And that's part of the reason there was such an interest in ancient Greek and Roman culture, because they were reading things, you know, about Plato, Aristotle, Vitruvius, you know, you name it. So it was a really exciting time. And the plague was over. The plague happened in the 14th century. So it's kind of a little bit like what we're going through. In that we had COVID, you know how that was. Well, imagine the plague. It took them almost 100 years, though, to get over it in Europe. But then,
so we're not doing so bad, y'all.
Yeah, right. So we still have hope.
Yeah, absolutely. Mm-hmm. So where did this begin, this Renaissance?
Okay, well, it actually began in Florence, Italy.
This is my big moment, y'all, so I got to make sure I do this right. All right, you ready?
There you go.
Oh, look at there. Oh, so fancy.
Italy was not the country we know it today. It was made up of separate city-states. And many of them were actually mortal enemies and fought each other and all that kind of stuff. But it was relatively peaceful during the Renaissance. And Florence, you can see they're by the water. So they had trade, sea trade. And the innovations, well, the idea of printing and paper making, that actually came from China. And another thing that came from China that helped them was silk. And so the silk trade, that's part of why Columbus was not only going for the spices, he was going for things like silk. So in Florence, they were raising silkworms, they were weaving silk, and in fact, they became very famous for a type of velvet. Now, they're still weaving silk in Italy, not as much as, you know, back then, but I went on actually it was a silk velvet weaving tour of Italy.
Didn't even know that you could do that.
That's where I got these. Yeah. So this is the kind of silk. It's called voided silk. And if you look, there's little loops that are cut, little loops that are not cut. These were all hand woven. And this is the kind of silk that really made Florence have the biggest bank actually in Europe. It was this sort of trade. Now, these were also made in Italy, but they were manufactured, but a lot like the silk, because the silk during the Renaissance also had gold and silver threads wrapped around it. And so this is silk also, but these were, and that's how the silk would have looked, except those were the, you know, modern versions. So they also wove some wool. But I'm really interested in craft history, so I'm always like pushing the crafts.
Well, I think this is important because you need to understand that the artists of the time, especially in the Renaissance, were supported because there was prosperity. And when people had extra money, then they could spend it on developing culture and art and other things. And so without that foundation, then we couldn't have had some of the great artists that we have today.
And also the artists were much better educated. So an artist, like in the medieval period, an artist was just a craftsperson, you know, a grunt laborer. But during the Renaissance, they were, you know, they were aware of the classics. Many of them were scientists. You know, they were very respected and sought after guests, you know, to have, you know, at your palazzo to show off to people. So it was really an exciting time to be alive.
Now, I know that I've heard that it has been said about Da Vinci that he was both a man of his time and a man before his time. And you talked about how these artists were really great at a lot of things. So why is that said about Da Vinci?
Okay, well, he was a man of his time because he was born illegitimate, which you've probably heard. And so if he had been born during the medieval period and lived the rebellious life that he lived, he probably would have been burned at the stake, seriously.
Oh, wow.
But being born during the Renaissance, where your intellect and talent was respected and sought after, he was able to really rise. And he was able to be the rebel that he was, because I'm getting a little ahead of myself in my notes, but he was left-handed, for one thing. I went to Catholic school, and I never knew why the nuns were doing this. Thank God I'm right-handed. But if the nun saw a left-handed kid writing, she would take the yardstick and slap the hand and say, "Of the devil." And, you know, all of us kids were like, and I never knew what that was about until I started teaching art history. And in the Last Judgment paintings, you can see on Christ's left, that's the side of hell. Because in Italian, left is sinistra, or sinister. So the left side is the side of the devil. So, you know, I wasn't even allowed to be left-handed. Thank God I wasn't. But in Leonardo's time, that was a big deal to be left-handed. And you've probably heard that he wrote in his notebooks backwards. Well, that's because they were using liquid ink. So if you're writing left-handed, you have to write that way or your hand would smear, you know, all the writing. So it also enabled him to be a little bit secretive, but he also never married. He left a lot of pieces unfinished. I mean, he was a rebel in so many ways, but he was very well liked. He was very charismatic, and he was actually tall and very attractive.
Don't talk about me not here, girl.
Yeah, but you know, he had to hustle because in fact, he was from Vinci, which is just outside of Florence. And that's what his last name is. It means Leonardo of Vinci. Because he was illegitimate, he couldn't take his father's last name. If he had been a Medici, he would be Leonardo de Medici, you know. But he's just some Leonardo, you know, the Leonardo from Vinci. Oh, yeah, that Leonardo, you know.
It'd be like Mitch of Livingston.
Right,
so.
Right.
Okay. Well, what are some of his earliest paintings? We're going to look at one here, right?
Okay. Well, because he was born illegitimately to a poor woman, he wasn't able to go to school. But that actually worked in his favor because he was so curious, and she had the hands-off approach, unlike the helicopter parents of today. You know, I could just see her saying, "Okay, Leonardo, go have fun, you know, come for dinner." Yeah. And he went and explored everything. And so he wasn't prejudiced with the standard lessons of the day. He learned everything from observing nature. And in fact, we see his vast curiosity was really an important part of his personality.
Yeah. So what do we have going on in this painting here?
So he was able to study painting. He apprenticed with Verrocchio, and that was the way you would learn how a craft or an art in those days. Yeah. And so he so he painted this. This is one of his first complete paintings, because he has some paintings where it's Verrocchio's painting, and they say, oh, he might have done this part or that part. But this is one we know was actually by Da Vinci. And it was incredibly innovative, because the paintings from the medieval period, Mary looks really stiff and she's on a throne, and she almost looks like an alien. But here she's actually modeled after the rich Florentine. She's sitting in front of a Florentine palace, and notice she's reading. Now she wouldn't have been reading if it weren't the Renaissance, but
Right.
this is a woman reading outside, and the drapery is very realistic looking, which was also innovative. And then look at the background. In all of his paintings, just about all of them, there's a very interesting background: mountains, caves, trees. He didn't just paint a blue sky, with a couple clouds in it. And the plants themselves, you can botanically identify all those flowers. But it's also, he didn't just paint a picture of a person from the outside. He was very interested in the head, in psychology, and what makes people tick. So in this painting, Gabriel has just told Mary, "You're about to conceive." And she's like, "Wait a minute. How's that possible,
I get it. Yeah.
And it's enough for her to stop reading what she was reading.
Yeah.
Probably some really good book,
Right. Yeah.
But that's typical of Leonardo, to paint some kind of scene where something's happening,
Yeah.
showing emotion, showing personality.
Yeah.
Now this is the only painting that's in the United States, and that's why I included it. It's in the National Gallery of Art in Washington. Leonardo actually didn't paint very many paintings, and he finished, very few of them. He did do a lot of sketchbooks and notebooks, and some of those are in the US. In fact, Bill Gates bought one of the notebooks, which was on exhibit about 10 years ago. I saw it in some museum. They had taken it apart.
Yeah.
It was in a dark room, but it was really kind of interesting.
Yeah.
And now you can see them online. But anyway, this is the only one in the States, and she's a young woman. Her name is Ginevra, and she was from a wealthy family, and they think this was probably her engagement portrait, which was normal at the time. And the other thing about Leonardo's painting, you don't see any harsh lines, because he noticed we don't really have, well, now I have lines on my face because I'm old.
Same.
But she didn't. And so he would do this kind of shading, it's called chiaroscuro, dark to light, which was, becoming popular. But he also did something called sfumato. Sfumo means smoke in Italian. And so it's like this smoky kind of look, to like almost like a haze, which really gives you the sense of 3 dimensions. And that's what's typical of Renaissance art. It looks very realistic, because instead of the spiritual outlook of the world, the Renaissance people saw the world as being God's greatest creation, that God put in motion, and that his best creation was actually a person. And so in the Renaissance, they believe the more you discover about how the world works, about how the body works, you are understanding God. Whereas in the previous century, everything was a big mystery. You weren't supposed to question anything. And that's why I said he probably would get burned at the stake, because one of the things he did that was very illegal was he did dissections of humans and animals to better understand how the body worked, so that he could not only understand but paint, because he painted from the inside out. He wasn't just painting, the surface.
Right. And that was illegal at the time, right?
To
dissect on cadavers and things.
Right. Yeah. It was very illegal.
Yeah. Well, so a second ago, you showed us a picture of the Annunciation, right? Or of the Christ child. we're approaching the Christmas season. I'm wearing my plaid, right?
Yeah.
So did he do other paintings that were of this kind of
Oh
subject
yeah,
matter?
yeah, he did. This is one of his unfinished paintings, Adoration of the Magi. Now, typically when you, like today when you paint, you get your canvas and you might do a sketch and you just go for it. But the way they painted back then, it was in layers. So first you had to do this monochromatic layer. And well, actually, first you did a sketch and then you transferred it to your canvas or panel. And then you did this monochromatic kind of painting underneath. And then you started adding your colors. Oh, the other thing about Leonardo, why he was, what's good he was born then, is because oil paint had just been invented.
Okay.
And now it was actually an invention from Northern Europe, and they were using it like to paint houses and stuff. And then artists started to realize with oil paint, it dries so slowly, you can blend your colors really well. So that's also what helped Leonardo do that kind of sfumato shading and all of that. So he never did finish this, but right after he did this, he got a job in Milan, and he was actually in Milan for, I think it was 17 years working for the Duke. He started working in Florence, he went to Milan, he went back to Florence, he spent some time in Venice, and he died actually in France, living with King Francis II. And those were all countries that were at war with one another during his lifetime. But that shows you what a good salesman he was, because he could sell himself to all these different dukes or kings or whatever. And he, in fact, when he went to Milan, his letter to the Duke was, I can do just about anything. I can build fortifications, I can design weapons, and by the way, I can also sculpt and paint.
Yeah.
And he did just about all of that stuff when he was there. And he was there until the French invaded and killed the Duke. So
It's pretty incredible,
yeah,
his list of what he was able to do.
yeah.
Now, you've mentioned a couple things about what makes his paintings unique before, but what else really stands out in addition to, some of the things that you mentioned?
Well, it's also the pyramidal arrangement of his figures. I forgot to point that out in the Annunciation, where Mary was very pyramidal. If you look at the wall there, we're going to see that Virgin of the Rocks is very pyramidal. It becomes very standard during the Renaissance because everything's very stable. And if we do a talk about the Baroque, which followed, everything's very active and people are flying everywhere. But in the Renaissance, it's stable, prosperity, all of that kind of stuff, stability. It was really reflected in the art.
All right. Well, so outside of this, what are some of his most well-known works of art?
Okay.
Well, we also had
Okay.
some of these.
Well, he did the one on the left when he went to Milan. And you notice they look very similar. A lot of artists will do this. If there's a piece that somebody likes, they'll reproduce it, for the next person. So the one on the left is actually in the Louvre Museum in Paris. This one is in the National Gallery in London. It's called Virgin of the Rocks because of the interesting background. If you notice, they're also in a pyramidal shape. And Mary, again, instead of looking like some alien sitting on a throne, she's a protective mother. She has her arm around John the Baptist, actually. And then the angel below has Jesus, and Jesus is blessing. That's what this symbol is. And so it's a very loving, a very intimate kind of portrait, but incredibly detailed when you look at all the different plants and the geological formations, and you can see his interest in geology because he was the foremost geologist, map maker. You can go down the list, mathematician, astronomer, you name it, and he was like number one.
I think one of the things I love about him the most is that he had an insatiable curiosity about everything.
Yeah.
He just wanted to know about the entire world,
Right.
and I think that is so interesting, and also gave him such a unique perspective in his paintings because he learned about the natural world. Then you can see that reflected in his paintings because he learned about the human body by dissecting. You can see that in the musculature in the painting, and so he applied all of the knowledge he was gaining in his art, and I think that's part of what makes it so incredible.
And also, the best way to learn something is to reproduce it. And he didn't have a phone, a camera, none of those were invented. So all he had was, a pen or paint. So that's what I realized when I started painting. I had never noticed, we went outside with a class and we had to do a landscape. I had never noticed the reflection of clouds on water before I painted. And when you have to draw something or paint something, you start to notice everything, every little wrinkle, every little this or that, or how many petals are on that flower, And so for him, it was more than just an aesthetic thing. It was his scientific, exploration.
Yeah,
Um,
for sure. Well, speaking of that, this is one of the, and it's on your shirt as well, which I appreciate. We got to notice her fine shirt as well.
So now he often would build on the work of others. He just didn't invent this or that all the time. And so this is called the Vitruvian Man, because Vitruvius was a Roman architect, mathematician, who wrote that on the right there, which I don't think I have to read. But essentially what it says, if you go to the belly button of the person, if you have the perfectly proportioned man, from the belly button up to the top of the head is half the body, to the bottom of the foot is half. So
I'm gonna go home and measure tonight.
Yeah. So you have the square, at the bottom and the top. And then when you put your arms out, that should be half from the tips of your hands. So the perfect proportion man makes a square. But then if you put the legs diagonal and the arms diagonal, it forms a perfect circle. So Vitruvius had written this, and there were a couple sketches by people along the way, but Leonardo's really pulled it together. And so he calls it Vitruvius. Well, I don't know if he does or an art historian labeled it, because a lot of the titles of all the art pieces were really given later by art history people.
Well, one of the most famous ones that probably a lot of us have heard about is The Last Supper. This is something that a lot of people have painted over the course of history, but what makes his so unique and special?
Okay, well, the ones before, usually Judas is on the other side of the table. And Leonardo, he painted the time when Christ said, "One of you will betray me." So they're
Again,
all
those
like,
dramatic moments that
they're all like, "Are you kidding?" And you can see them. Did you hear what he just said? There's no way I would do it, And so they're all reacting, which is typical Leonardo. And also numerology was important back then. So you have 4 groups of 3. 3 represents the Trinity. 4, the 4 evangelists. So you have 4 groups of 3, and then 12 apostles, which is also the 12 tribes of Israel. And then Christ himself is in the perfect triangle like the Trinity. And instead of having halos on their head, Christ has this window behind him, and all the lines of perspective. Linear perspective was developed by Bruno Leschi a little bit earlier than Leonardo, but still in the Renaissance. And so what you do with one-point perspective, you have a point and all the lines come to that one point. Well, in this case, it's on Christ's head.
Ooh, wait,
so you can see all the lines of the windows, the ceiling beams, all of that. So it's, again, an emotional kind of a time. They're all, kind of individual portraits. But the problem is, it was painted in the dining hall of a monastery, which was appropriate. And it's high up on the wall, which was appropriate because in the Bible, the Last Supper was, I think, on the second story. But with a plaster wall, the only choice they had was, it's called fresco. So you have to prepare your wall when it's still damp. You have to start to, put on your paint and all that. So you did little sections at a time from start to finish. Well, Leonardo didn't work that way. He wanted to do a little over here and a little over there and, step back and look. And so he decided, being the experimenter, to combine oil paint with tempera paint, which is egg-based. Those were the 2 popular paints used for panels or canvas, and glue. And so even in his lifetime, the paint started to flake off.
Oh, no.
And but he would have loved acrylic, because with acrylic paint, he could have done that. He could have painted a little here, a little there. It wouldn't have mattered. But so there's been a lot of restorations, and it's been through a lot. Like when Napoleon went through, his soldiers stayed there. At one point, they were using it as a stable. In World War II, the monastery was bombed, but fortunately, they had sandbags piled up on both sides of the wall. So this wall survived, even though the sandbags also caused a problem. Yeah. But between 77 and 1999, there was an incredible restoration where the restorers went with these magnifying glasses, like millimeter by millimeter, restoring it. And so they tried to take off all of the bad restoration and just kind of watercolor more or less, in the areas they thought, were that color. But anyway, it's an incredible.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like it's kind of impressive that we even have any of it today, since it was already starting to fall apart in his day. So we're pretty lucky that any of it has survived.
We are lucky. Yeah. Okay, so I mentioned that he also designed weapons, and that's what helped him,
as one does in your free time, right?
Well, that's what helped him get jobs with people like the Duke, because the Duke of Milan, he was fighting everyone around, including Florence. And so this is an example of, he didn't invent the crossbow, but he designed an 82-foot wide crossbow. I don't know if they ever actually built this back then, but it would have had a screw and then a ratchet, and then you could release the string with, I guess, this huge arrow. Yeah. Or I don't know if they put a cannonball, because they did have cannonballs back then. Yeah. So I don't know what the ammunition was, but if you can read the writing, it's going backwards in Italian.
Yeah.
But
well, and this is interesting because also, in addition to creating weapons and things like that, in the PBS series that I've been watching, he also did aerial maps of places, which also is really useful to people, and lots of other things. So it's
very useful when you're going to conquer a city.
Right.
To know, because that's what, with a lot of cities, the way they were designed, especially, see, now the Romans, they always had this grid. That was very easy to invade and conquer. But the Muslims, their cities were like all windy. That was very difficult to get in and conquer, because you didn't, know where you were going. But if you have an aerial map and you can see where everything is, and where, this is where this person lives, we want to kill, and that person, Now, he was not a warmonger, but he wanted a job, and he knew these were his skills, and he did like to invent things.
You do what you got to do.
Right.
Well, obviously we can't have a talk about Leonardo without the big painting that everyone knows. So we got to talk about Mona Lisa. Okay. So, that's what everybody came for. We got to hear about it, right? Yeah. So talk to us about Mona Lisa as we start to wind down.
Well, first of all, Mona means miss. So I always thought her first name was Mona. No, her name is actually Lisa. So it's like Miss Lisa. And she was the 24-year-old wife of an Italian. Actually, I think he was a silk merchant too. He was pretty wealthy, and by the age 24, I think she had several kids already. But Leonardo never gave the painting to the husband, and so there's a lot of questions about why. Yeah. My theory is that she does not look very fancy. Normally, if you're of this stature, you have all your jewelry on, your really nice clothing. She's just dressed like plain old, Mona Lisa. And so I think that could be why the husband didn't like the painting. But we don't know why. When Leonardo died, the reason why this is at the Louvre is because Leonardo was living with the King of France, and he had brought this with him. But she's also, everyone's wondering, what is she thinking? And that's one of the big mysteries, and that's typical of Leonardo's work. It's not just a woman sitting there,
right?
But she's thinking something. And then, of course, you have that really interesting background And I think in the video they were saying how her hair kind of like blends in with the water. And then of course she has that sfumato kind of smoky haze. You know, you don't see any harsh lines.
Yeah.
And also the way she's sitting, before this time, the portraits were from the chest up, usually in profile, or the whole figure. This is half the figure. And then a lot of artists like Rembrandt afterwards, you know, copied this, and we're used to seeing this now. Also, there used to be columns on both sides. You can just see a little bit of the base of the columns.
Yeah.
For some reason, it was cut off. But
what do you think she's thinking? That's what I want to know.
I don't know. See, the first time I saw this, I was actually 6 years old.
Oh, wow.
And I asked my dad, because my dad said, this is the most famous painting in the world. And I'm like, why? He said, and there was no one there. When I was 6 years old, it was just a painting.
Yeah.
And he said, walk by in front of her and look at her eyes, and her eyes will follow you. And I tried it, and as a kid, it did seem to freak me out. But I don't think that's true today. But I think she's just very, you know, content. She has that look of what they call sprezzatura, you know, like, I'm confident, I'm okay, you know, I'm, you know, I'm being who, you know, everything I can be kind of thing.
Okay.
But what do you think she's thinking?
I think she knows something we won't, and she won't tell us.
Oh, could be.
What I think. Yeah. Well, unfortunately, we're starting to run short of time. And so what I want to ask as we close out is, what do you think we should remember most about Da Vinci, in your opinion?
Well, he was someone who questioned everything, and he was very curious about everything. And he was, you know, when they talk about how people of different areas of expertise should get together and work together, I think he shows that as one person. That's what he was doing. He was, you know, a scientist, an artist, a mathematician, that you know, inter-exchange of knowledge from all different areas is such a good thing. But the questioning and the looking and learning from what you're seeing, don't believe what you hear, look at the actions and make your, you know, make your decisions that way. Because he didn't, you know, believe this or that was common knowledge. He was like, well, you know, prove it to me.
Yeah. Well, and as you said, there's only one that you can see in DC in America, but you can go overseas and see lots and lots of wonderful Leonardo paintings and other artifacts as well. And so if you are more interested, I'm sure that Carol will be happy to talk to you about other questions if you have those as well. But thank you so much for your time and presenting about Leonardo for us today.
Okay, well, thank you, Luke.